morning. I appreciate y'all coming on today and learning this topic, neurodivergence in the family system with me. If you would like to participate in our post survey, it's an opportunity for you to give me your feedback and offer suggestions for future trainings. Please put your email address in the chat box. This is how I will send you that survey. So after we have our time today, I will send you that survey if you're interested in participating. It's not required in anything, of course. It's just an opportunity for you to take your opinions and your feelings and all that stuff and blast it out to me so that I can use it to improve my job and provide trainings that are actually valid and useful for what you're doing on your day-to-day. So today we're going to talk about how neurodivergence impacts the family system as a whole. It's not going to be very deep or clinical. It's just going to be a way of bringing to the foreground, bringing to the attention that a diagnosis of a child in the family system doesn't just affect that child, right? It doesn't just impact the child. It can impact everybody in this family system. Ooh, sorry. There we go. It's the wrong button. Okay. So in this training, we're going to try and give you a little bit of clarity about how we can take care of the entire family after a diagnosis of neurodivergence. And we're going to get into what that actually means here in a little bit. So it isn't just about the child, obviously. Family dynamics and roles and history, they all shape the story of the family system. So we're going to look beyond the diagnosis. We're going to look beyond the label together today. Okay. So you might be here because you're supporting a neurodivergent child or a partner or a sibling. Maybe you've never had the words for what's happening, or maybe you've carried a label for years. But what we often overlook is how caregiving dynamics, roles, guilt, even gifts are shaped by that system that we're part of. And so, again, we're not going to be very clinical or diagnostic in this training. We're just going to take a really compassionate look about how the whole family is impacted, including you as a caregiver, with the diagnosis of neurodivergence. So before we get any further, we want to go ahead and define neurodivergence so that we're all on the same page. So maybe you've heard the term neurodivergent before, or maybe it's brand new to you. But it really just means it's just a term that we use to describe brains that are wired differently than what we are consider typical. Okay, so it's not a clinical label. You're not going to go and be diagnosed with neurodivergence. It's just a descriptive word. Okay, it's an inclusive way of talking about neurological variation, so how our brain processes information. Okay, so this can include autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome, OCD, okay, and others. So that's kind of the house we're going to be in today. And sometimes they're diagnosed and sometimes they're not. But here's what we really want to focus on. It is not a flaw, okay? It's not a behavior problem. It's not a parenting failure. It's just a difference in how somebody feels, thinks, and processes and how they relate to the world, okay? So oftentimes these diagnoses, they come with really beautiful gifts like creativity, empathy, deep focus, pattern recognition. But we know it also does bring some challenges, right? But we're going to move beyond pathologizing brains. One day I'm going to learn how to say that word, I promise you. But we're just going to learn how to see all the different types of brains, right? These are just differences in how we perceive the world and how we interact with the world based off of our brains. So it is important to note that many forms of neurodivergence are diagnosed as clinical disorders, right? Like autism spectrum disorder or ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But many families and advocates are shifting the language to emphasize that these are differences, they're not flaws, okay? So maybe labeled as a disorder, and we don't want to take away from the challenges that come with that diagnosis. But we really want to just focus on how it's not a flaw, right? It's differences, okay? So it's not about ignoring those challenges. Those are very real, but we want to create a space to see a person more fully beyond their diagnosis, okay? So they're not broken, they're just different. And just shifting in that perspective can make a world of difference for you and your loved one who's taking or who's getting care from you. Okay, so it's not a flaw, it's just a difference. So when you get a diagnosis, I know a lot of parents, they struggle trying to get an ADHD diagnosis or an autism diagnosis and things like that. And when you don't have that diagnosis, you're really bound. You're not going to get a lot of the services that you're going to need without the diagnosis. Okay, so you can get the diagnosis and it can actually feel very like a relief, right? Like finally we know what's going on, right? Finally, once we know that, we can tackle the issue head on because we know what we're dealing with now, right? And that language will give you clarity and access to support. But it can also become a spotlight that kind of narrows your view, right? And it centers all the attention on the person who's diagnosed, right? So now little Johnny isn't just Johnny anymore, he's ADHD Johnny, he's autism Johnny, right? And so we often forget that a diagnosis doesn't label a person, and also it exists within a family system. Okay, so that system, your family relationships, your emotional history, things like that, those really, really matter. And so when a child's diagnosed, the whole family begins to shift, right? So you may see a shift in roles. Expectations are maybe going to be reevaluated. Sometimes resentment or guilt or even relief can surface all at the same time, and that's normal, okay? So today we're going to zoom out, not to take away or diminish a person's individual experiences, but really just to honor how everyone in the family is shaped by it, okay? So family systems theory was developed in 1978, and this theory suggests that families function as emotional units, okay? So when one member changes, the whole system responds. And this can be for anything. It doesn't have to be a neurodivergence diagnosis. It can be any medical diagnosis. It could be a drug addiction. It can be divorce. It can be any of these things, okay? But we're just realizing that the family kind of moves together in a system, okay? So there's individuals, but each individual is impacted in different ways by the same thing, okay? So siblings of neurodivergent individuals, they often report an increase in empathy and emotional strain. Okay, so there's some pros and cons, right? Of course, anytime that there's a shift in what we consider typical, there's going to have to be some space to adapt, right? And to grow and to change and to shift. And so sometimes those changes cause problems, and sometimes they actually help cultivate strengths, right? So if we look at this through a trauma-informed lens, all family members may experience stress differently, right? So we know that. And behavioral shifts often reflect how that person is adapting and what strategies they have in place rather than a dysfunction, okay? So sometimes you may find that when you have a diagnosis and the energy shifts a little bit, there's going to be some, you know, live wires there for a minute, right? Where people try to acclimate to that change and try to understand and try to cope with that change, okay? So again, that doesn't mean that there's like a dysfunction in that space. It can be, right? But it's not always a dysfunction. It could just be the time it takes for them to adapt and acclimate to the new normal, right? Of what's going on in the family. So let's talk about the system itself for a little bit, okay? So every family has its own like unspoken patterns, right? The ways that they relate to each other, the ways that we balance, the way that we cope, right? How do we maintain that homeostasis? And they're really not taught directly, okay? But they are felt. So think about who calms the tension in the house, who gets ignored, who always shows up, who always needs care. Okay, so we're seeing that there's unspoken but very well defined roles in our family systems that we might not even notice. Like, so for instance, in my family, I'm kind of what you would consider the default parent. Okay, so my kids will walk right past their dad and ask me a question because that's my role, right? It wasn't something that I declared to them. It's an unspoken understanding that they all have. Okay, so that's kind of what we're navigating here. So in systems theories, we understand that families operate kind of like a mobile sculpture, right? You know, those little things that you hang over your baby's crib and it's got those little things dangling. It's like all individual things, but they're all connected together. That's kind of how a family system operates, okay? So when one piece shifts, even if it's just a little bit, everything else adjusts to restore that balance, okay? So when someone in the family is neurodivergent, that can seem like a very dramatic shift, right? Suddenly routines, expectations, even emotional energy is redistributed, right? So if you think about if you have a little one who has autism spectrum disorder, right? And so if they have sensory sensitivities that prevent them from being able to say go to the playground, right? Go to the park. Well, then of course that impacts all the siblings in the family, because then it becomes about that one child and managing them and their symptoms and their expressions rather than focusing on the children who don't need that additional care, right? So the family system shifts, okay? So here's the key. Neurodivergence doesn't just disrupt the system, okay? It actually reveals the system, right? It shows us what's already there. It shows us those unspoken rules. It shows us those inherited belief systems. It shows us how we habitually relate to one another, right? So of course, we're not trying to blame anybody for that. It's just, it's something that makes us aware, right? Oh, well, now I see why, you know, this is happening, right? Now I understand because of, you know, something I was told when I was younger, and now I'm behaving in this way towards this stress or towards this this divergence or whatever it is. And so it kind of makes you think a little bit more, not only about what you're doing, but why you're doing it. Okay, so it can really be revelation, right? And sometimes that doesn't always go over so well, but sometimes it can be used as an opportunity to grow and strengthen. And I hope that's what you all end up doing by default. Um, because when we see our systems clearly, when we see these patterns and these roles clearly, we can start to choose our roles rather than just repeat them, okay? So a little bit of research evidence for you here. The Bowen family systems theory highlights what we call homeostasis, okay? So that is the drive towards balance within a family, even if the balance is dysfunctional, okay? And I'm not saying you guys are in a dysfunctional space, but family systems theory goes beyond a neurodivergent diagnosis. So, you know, you think about, you know, just different things that could knock a family system out of homeostasis. Everyone in that space is going to try to compensate and restore that balance, even if it's at the detriment to other people in that family system, okay? So the structural family therapy introduced the idea of realigning roles and subsystems to support family health when systems become rigid, okay? So there's, and this was back in like 1974. So this is well researched, well documented, well evidenced that the family acts as a system, as a structure, okay? So we can consider a neurodivergent diagnosis as a catalyst, right? So research shows that children with autism or ADHD often cause families to reevaluate, how do we communicate with each other? How do we regulate emotions? What are our strategies? And what are our expectations that we've inherited it generationally, okay? I don't know about you all, but when I got the diagnosis for my children, I really did have to realize like some of the things that I do as a parent are not things that I've really chosen to do. It's just something that I was taught to do, right? And then I realized very quickly that some of those old systems were not applicable to my family, right? They weren't getting the results that I thought they were going to get. And so I had to reevaluate, how do I cope? How do I handle my own emotions? How do I teach emotional regulation to my children? And I'll be honest with you, I didn't even realize that that's something I had to do. You know, like as a parent, I just figured, well, you know, we have emotions and we deal with them and they're going to learn as, you know, as they grow. But then when I realized that, you know, there's a difference in how they view the world and how they internalize information, that I had to learn how to better navigate my emotional responses because that's how they were going to learn, right? So just a side note, it happens and it can happen very behind the scenes and very unintentionally. But then when we have a diagnosis and we start to realize, oh, maybe this isn't going to work for my family because of this neurodivergence, right? So we start to reevaluate that, and we start to learn, and we start to cope, and we start to shift, and those are good things, right? So common family roles around neurodivergent. Okay, so a family role isn't something that you necessarily, get a badge for, you put it on, and everyone knows, mom is this, dad is that, siblings are this, right? Um, we don't always choose those roles that we play in the family. Sometimes they're just handed to us, and sometimes it's through silence, right? People just assume you're going to do these things. And sometimes we build them in as a response to stress, right? Sometimes you don't you don't get the role of peacemaker because your emotional regulation skills are not very peaceful, and so that role falls to somebody else, right? And sometimes we just inherit them. Okay, so let's name a few roles that often emerge in families that are navigating neurodivergence. So, of course, I'm not trying to diagnose anybody. That's not what a role is. It's not a diagnosis. It's just being aware of adaptive patterns. Okay, so how do we adapt? How do we cope? And what role does that surface in us as we do that? Okay, and most of us are going to shift between more than one. Okay, so the first one, the fixer. So this is someone who wants to solve every problem, right? They're maybe constantly researching. They feel responsible for everybody's happiness. And this person is going to carry the weight of hope and guilt. Okay. So this is probably going to be a primary parent or primary caretaker that's going to be in the fixer role. Okay. Um, Next, the invisible one. So this person is going to kind of stay out of the way. They don't want to cause any trouble. They keep their needs to themselves. They're very quiet about what they need, almost forgotten. And they learn to disappear to preserve the peace. Okay, so this may be perhaps an older sibling who knows the younger sibling needs a lot of attention and care. And so their way of being part of that system is to become invisible, right? So they're not going to cause problems. They're not going to stress out their parents or their grandparents or whomever they're living with. They're going to internalize a lot of stuff because they want to be out of the way. They don't want to cause any problems, okay? Or it could be a spouse, right? It could be the other caregiver and or the co-parent in that space that is kind of trying to fade into the background, right? Next, the overachiever. So this person is going to excel in school or excel in work. And this is a way to kind of compensate for maybe a more chaotic home environment, right? So they may internalize pressure to be the easy one, right? They feel loved for performance, not presence, right? So this again could be a kiddo who is gonna always get the straight A's. They're always gonna get the good attitude marks or whatever from their teacher because they don't want to cause any more stress to be heaped onto their family because of the stress that's already there, right? Next, the peacemaker. So this person is going to mediate conflicts. They may be the one to rush in to smooth over outbursts. They're worried about everybody's getting along, and this person will typically become the emotional sponge in the family system. Okay. Next, the identified patient. So this is the person who is probably the one that's diagnosed with something. They have the most visible struggles. Um, they are the one who is maybe expressing the family's unspoken pain. Okay, so this one might not always be the one who's diagnosed, but it could be somebody who is maybe they have a hard time handling the stress and the chaos, and so they act out. Okay, or maybe they feel like they're not getting enough attention, but they know that if they do something to get in trouble, they're going to get that attention, right? And they may not be doing it like intentionally, right? They might not be thinking, well, if I, break this thing, I'm going to get attention from my parents. They might, but it might be very subtle and almost in the background. They don't even realize they're doing it. So these are just some of the more common roles. And none of them are shameful. I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad for these roles. These are just the signs of how deeply we love and how hard we're trying to really get back to that homeostasis. Okay, we're trying to find balance. But when we don't examine these roles, they can really limit us, and we can realize that we're not actually helping, we're coping, right? So do any of those sound like someone you love? Do any of them sound like you? And again, these are common in all family systems. They're not necessarily just for a neurodivergent diagnosis, okay? So family roles and codependency. Again, these are long studied, long researched, decades old theories, okay? But these similar roles will appear in families that are dealing with addiction, trauma, illness, okay? So these are suggesting that there are systemic adaptations to stress, okay? So it doesn't really matter what the stress is, the family systems are going to adapt and create these roles without even really doing it on purpose, okay? It's just how we operate as human animals, okay? So there have been some studies, and one of them is called the Sibling Adaptation Study, and this was done in 2007, and it says that siblings of neurodivergent individuals often assume caretaker or invisible roles affecting identity development and mental health. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the term parentification. So this is something where in a family system, if the parents or the main caretakers are focused on one thing, one person, one situation, the siblings in the family system may then step up and start doing things that you would typically see an adult or a person, caretaking person to do. So maybe it's an older sibling that helps the younger one get ready for school and packs their lunches for them, or maybe they're making dinner plans, right? Because mom and dad or whomever are always preoccupied with the child who has the special needs, okay? And again, this isn't necessarily something that's wrong, and it's not necessarily something that happens on purpose. It's just that family system, right? Adapting naturally to create that balance, okay, to keep that homeostasis. Let's see here. Yeah. So narrative therapy supports deconstructing fixed roles to create more flexible, empowered identities. So what does that mean? It means that if you are now aware that you have a child in your family system who is being parentified, right? That they are taking on more responsibility because they want to be helpful or they see a gap that they're trying to fill. When you realize that's going on, you can then take steps to deconstruct that role for them and give them more empowered identities and say, you know, you can still be a kid. You can be helpful, but you can still be a kid, right? You're not solely responsible for all this. That's what my job is, right? But if we don't notice that that's happening, we might be thinking, oh, thank God Jane is here because she's always such a help, right? But if you continue to keep your child in that role, it could cause problems later on down the road for them and their identity. And so we just kind of want to be aware of it and make sure that we're taking the proper steps to allow that child to be a child. Okay, so that's just an example. So when guilt enters the system, right? I don't know if guilt ever just enters. To me, I feel like it's just there all the time. Maybe it's just a me thing. I don't know. But guilt is one of the most common and least talked about experiences in caregiving families, right? But it shows up in everybody in different ways. So for parents, it might sound like that running script of, did I cause this? Am I doing enough? Why can't I stay calm, right? Those are all guilt-led questions. And for siblings, it might sound like, why am I so different? Or I feel selfish for wanting attention, right? Or I'm scared to need anything, right? And these might be things that go through their mind all the time and you never know about it because they never talk about it, right? And if you're a caregiver who came from a family where your own needs were never met, guilt can sneak up just because you want to have boundaries, right? Or maybe because you feel resentful. And so you're feeling guilty about those feelings. Um, but here's a reframe, okay, that I want to offer to you. Guilt is not a weakness, okay? It is the echo of love distorted by pressure, okay? Because if you didn't care, you wouldn't feel guilty for maybe feeling like you don't measure up, right? Like I don't feel guilty not being, measuring up to somebody else's standards if I don't love them. I don't care. Go ahead and be mad. I'm not worried about it. But if I care about you, yeah, it's gonna impact me a little bit more, right? So guilt, again, it doesn't show up because you're not caring. It shows up because you are, okay? It says, I care so much that I'm afraid of doing it wrong. I'm afraid of failing, right? But the truth is, you're not failing, right? You're just feeling. And feelings always deserve our compassion, not our punishment. Okay. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Um, so, caregiver guilt and stress, again, very well studied, very well researched. And it shows that parents of neurodivergent children report significantly higher levels of guilt and self blame than parents of neurotypical children. And this was a study by Woodgate and their team back in 2008. Okay. But I think I'm preaching to the choir, right? But it's been studied, right? There's significantly higher levels of guilt and self blame in your family system if you have a child who has a neurodivergent diagnosis. Okay. Sibling guilt is also there as well, right? Sibling may take on that burden and feel guilty that they're not doing it right, or they're causing problems, or they don't want to express their feelings because they feel guilty. It's just going to cause more stress, right? And of course, that is associated with higher rates of anxiety, right? Role confusion, we talked about that earlier, especially if they're feeling overshadowed by their siblings' needs. They can feel guilty for having needs of their own, okay? But the good news is, once we acknowledge that guilt, once we acknowledge that anxiety or that discomfort or that self blame, we can do something called compassion focused therapy. Now, you don't have to go to a professional for this. Of course, if you feel like you need to, there's always resources available and I can connect you to those. But compassion focused therapy is really just a way that we reframe our guilt as a natural emotional response. And that can be softened through self kindness, not suppressed through shame. Okay, so if we feel guilty and then we beat ourselves up for feeling guilty, guess what? Now we just feel guilty and ashamed. Doesn't help you, right? But if you address your guilt with self compassion, and say, of course I feel this way. Anyone in my situation would feel this way. I can feel guilty and not be guilty, right? We offer ourselves that self compassion. Guess what? It softens that guilt and it chases shame right out of the equation. Okay. So we want to encourage naming the guilt and inviting regulation and reprocessing rather than a moral flaw that we have or a shame that we should carry with us. Okay. So guilt will be there, but how you respond to guilt is going to be the make or break moment for you. Are you going to feel shamed? Or are you going to wallow in that guilt? Or are you going to meet that guilt with self-compassion and teach self-compassion to your younger ones, right? If your little ones are feeling guilty, show them how it feels to be compassionate when that guilt arises, okay? All right. So let's talk about gifts hidden in the system. Okay, so we've talked about the hard parts, right? We talked about roles, we've talked about guilt and pressure and all that stuff. But there's something that happens in these systems too, right? The gifts. So I'm not talking toxic positivity here, right? Not silver linings, but real embodied capacities that often emerge when love and survival meet. Okay, so the first one, empathy. So kiddos raised alongside neurodivergent siblings often learn to read emotions with incredible sensitivity, right? They become very tuned in, very responsive, very intuitive, okay? Now, of course, if that's skewed, right, then the person may have a hard time compartmentalizing their emotions and somebody else's emotions, right? And then that can lead to very kind of loosey-goosey boundaries, okay? But empathy in and of itself can be cultivated in these spaces where we have to show compassion, we have to show understanding, we have to have that emotional resilience, right? Empathy is just a natural byproduct of that. Next, resilience. So many caregivers and siblings alike develop deep inner strength, right? So you've weathered that stress and you've come up with creative solutions, right? And you still show up with love, right? That's what resilience is. Like, yes, this is hard, but I can get through it. I can do it, right? And using those coping skills, using that emotional intelligence, using that self-care, that's what's going to help you build that resilience. So, the stress isn't going anywhere, but we can learn how to contain it in a more healthy, balanced way, right? Next, creativity. So families that adapt daily routines to support neurodivergence often become very innovative problem solvers, right? So you come up with new routines, new rituals, new language, new ways to relate to one another. and other people, right? Because you're now not operating off of inherited expectations. You're operating out of a space of curiosity and creativity and problem solving, right? So it can definitely become a strength that can bleed out into all areas of your life. Next, perspective shifting. So being close to neurodivergence, this is going to invite people to question assumptions about what does success look like? What does intelligence look like? Communication, connection, right? So we can very easily see how when we learn how our child navigates the world, that we are just naturally going to inherit this skill set of shifting perspective, right? And so it can, again, become a strength, a part of your character throughout all of your relationships, not just the one you have with your child, right? I know for me that definitely has, right? I've become way more patient, way more understanding or open to understanding other people and how they view the world and how they navigate it because I've had to do that with all of my children, right? So I can't look at them and say, well, I don't feel this way. Why do you? I can say, well, I don't feel this way. Tell me why you do, right? It's just a very subtle shift, but it can make a huge difference. Next, pattern breaking. So some of us, some of you, are the first in your family to talk about emotions. Maybe you're the first person to set boundaries. Maybe you're the first person to ask better questions, right? So you're not just parenting, you're kind of healing generational things, right, that come up. And I don't want to get too into it, but I'm sure most of you, when I say that, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? So these gifts may come from pain, right? But they don't have to stay there. They can expand into strength. They can expand into insight and capacity, right? I know for me, growing up the way I did, it was very easy to think I was the problem, right? But now I can see, I can like look at my kiddos and be like, oh, I remember feeling like that. I can remember feeling ashamed. I can remember feeling like I was a bother in the way, right? And so then because my own personal experiences, I now have the capacity and the inner strength to get to their level and understand why they're feeling and give them that compassion that maybe I didn't get growing up, right? So it may have come from a place of trauma or damage, but it has now evolved into a capacity to flourish, right? So again, that perspective shift can mean the world of difference for you. And you can look at that and even claim it as part of your legacy, right? Every seed has to be buried in the dark soil before it blooms, right? So post-traumatic growth. So this is research, again, that shows caregiving under stress. It can increase emotional insight, resilience, and relational capacity. So, we know that stress can make or break you, right? How you navigate that stress, how you cope with that stress. Is it going to build resilience or is it going to build ruin in your life, right? But research shows that if you have a lot of stress in these spaces, it can still cultivate a lot of growth and a lot of strength in you and in your family system. And there are, again, more studies, longitudinal studies, show that increased emotional attunement and tolerance for ambiguity among siblings of children with autism. So that means that if you are a sibling or if you have, a child who has autism and they have siblings, those siblings are going to develop increased emotional attunement, right? And then more of a tolerance for emotions and ambiguity amongst their siblings. And neurodiversity affirming families tend to cultivate open communication and creativity to accommodate needs. And so this can really just reshape your family culture altogether, right? So your family system may look different than the one that you grew up in or that your spouse or your partner grew up in, right? Just because you now have this opportunity to shift your perspective and be creative and learn how to communicate differently than maybe your parents communicated with you, right? You've learned how to understand your child in a way that maybe your parents didn't learn to understand you, right? So it definitely reshapes that family culture. And then you think too, well, what are my kids' families going to look like if they have families, right? What are my kids' relationships with others going to look like now because I decided that I was going to course correct and I was going to shift, right? And I was going to approach this a little differently than my parents did. So there's a lot of beautiful and life-changing growth that can take place if you just embrace the self-compassion and the perspective shift, right? So speaking of generational stuff, let's get into generational neurodivergence, okay? So one of the most profound truths that we can acknowledge in a caregiving role is that the neurodivergent child may not be the beginning, they may be the revelation, okay? So a lot of families will say things like, "Oh, that's how your uncle was," right? Or "Your grandma hated loud noises too," right? Or "Hey, I struggled in school just like you did and no one helped me," right? So these may just be whispers of undiagnosed or unsupported neurodivergence that's been passed down silently throughout the generations, right? I know a lot of times you hear people say, well, they didn't have autism back when I was growing up. Yes, they did. Yes, we did. It just wasn't studied. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't treated in the same way that it is now. So it's not that we have more autism or more ADHD or more Tourette's, okay? It's that we are now more aware and we are more educated about it than we used to be, okay? So we're not trying to retroactively diagnose anybody in your family, but we do know that there is a genetic component to a lot of these diagnoses, right? And so sometimes it might have been seen as like a personality quirk, or maybe you or a family member was was labeled as difficult or lazy, or maybe there's even trauma responses in there, woven in because you or they, grew up being very misunderstood, and so that was traumatic to them because no one understood their inner world and nobody tried to. No one understood that there was a difference, right? Um, and sometimes when your kiddo gets diagnosed, you as a parent or a grandparent, suddenly you start to see yourself a little bit more clearly. You're like, oh, maybe it was ADHD the whole time, right? And it can make a big difference in how you see yourself, right? Because then you start to see yourself in your child, and then you start to respond differently, right? How would I have liked to have been responded to when I was behaving this way, when I was, 9 or 10 years old, right? So it's really just widening that lens so that you can parent and caregive with more compassion, right? And break those cycles of shame and break those cycles of suppression and silence, right? Um, so you weren't broken, maybe you were just never seen, right? I know for me, when my kiddos got diagnosed with their ADHD, I honestly just thought it was just hyperactivity, right? I thought it was just they can't sit down, they're bouncing off the walls. And I was like, that doesn't sound like my kids because my kids are very introverted, right? But then when I started to learn about what that means, what neurodivergence as far as ADHD is concerned, a lot of things start clicking. It's like, oh, I remember being like this when I was younger. I remember being a daydreamer. I remember not being organized and all these things, right? And so then you start to see like, oh, maybe I have that, right? And then maybe you're not going to beat yourself up as much as you used to. Okay. So, heritability of neurodivergent conditions. So, ADHD, autism, these both have very strong genetic components. Okay. And many undiagnosed adults identify only after their child receives a diagnosis, right? And many older adults, particularly women and BIPOC individuals, are misdiagnosed or overlooked due to diagnostic biases in our criteria. And that's from a study in 2020. Okay. And so, of course, there could just be cultural expectations for you. A lot of times they'll say, girls and women aren't diagnosed with ADHD until they hit college age, because the whole time they weren't struggling in their grades and they weren't, bouncing off the walls, right? They were able to maintain it in that space. But then when they get into college level spaces where they have to be more independent and the stress gets too much for them, that's when they crumble and they go to the doctor and the doctor's like, oh, you have ADHD, right? And so there is that misdiagnosis because again, culturally, we see things like ADHD as just a very hyperactive boy running out into the street, right? We don't think about girls staring out the window for hours at a time, right? That's also ADHD. And so, of course, you may recognize this later on in life, and that can cause maybe an emotional upheaval, right? But it can also be a relief, right? And again, that self-compassion can start flowing a lot more freely. Like, I'm not broken, I'm not flawed, I'm just different, right? And there's nothing wrong with being different. So it's very important for you as a caregiver to come to terms with your own neurotype while supporting a child. And you may be neurotypical, right? And that's fine too. Come to terms with that and know that you're going to see things a little differently than your kiddo. But you may also have what they have, right? And then there's that compassion, because then it's like, well, I understand how they feel. Okay. All right. Next, self-attunement. Okay. So a lot of times caregiving forces you to almost disappear, right? You are so-and-so's caretaker. You're so-and-so's parent, right? It might also ask you to be strong and unshakable, right? Put your needs on pause, maybe completely, like indefinitely, like I'll never meet a need of mine ever again because my kiddo needs so much of my attention, right? But also remember, you're not a cyborg. Hey, you're not a robot programmed to care for somebody else. You're not a machine for meeting needs, okay? You are a nervous system, you're a body, you're a soul, right? And so if you're always scanning for someone else's storm that's brewing, you're going to lose track of your own weather patterns, okay? So not to say that you don't want to focus on your kiddo and their needs, obviously, that's what we do. But we don't want to completely neglect our own needs in the process, okay? So self-attunement is not selfish. It's the act of remembering that, hey, I exist also, right? I'm also a person, okay? And how you handle your needs and how you meet your needs is going to impact the way you handle and meet the needs of other people. I've said it a gajillion times, right? Caring for you is caring for them. So if you ignore yourself because I don't want to be selfish and take that time away from my kiddo, um, you're just really setting yourself up for failure. You're setting yourself up for burnout. You're setting yourself up for resentment. Okay. So take that time to self-attune, figure out what's going on, right? So here's some questions, or here's a few questions I would like for you to ask yourself. When was the last time you asked your own body how it was doing? What do you need to feel like yourself again? Sure, caretaking is part of your identity, right? It's a role that you're in, but you don't have to lose yourself in that label, okay? I don't know why we like to label ourselves and others and then just stay in that space the rest of our lives. We are multifaceted. We can wear many hats. Okay, you can be caregiver and friend and individual and artist or reader or exerciser or whatever it is else that you are. Right? You don't just have to be that one thing. Okay. So even tiny minutes of self-attunement, right, can start to shift your system from survival to steadiness. So simple things like maybe taking a deep breath before you respond. That's self-attunement, right? Maybe listening to a song you really enjoy that calms you down or hypes you up, right? Stretching, right? Like, oh, maybe you're so stressed out and your shoulders start to cave in and your jaw clenches and you're just kind of, you know, really you're doing it. And then you stretch and take a deep breath and all of a sudden, whew, right? Your nervous system is triggered to calm when you do those things. Or even just a nice quiet sip of tea, right? These are just things that we do simply throughout the day to help us recalibrate. So we're not just constantly, crunching in on that stress and that strain over and over again all day long. Okay. I don't know about you, but some days I have days that are so stressful by the end of the day, it's like I have to like purposely like unfurl, like, oh man, I didn't realize I was hunched over like a goblin all day and here I am. But then you just kind of attune, right? And get into that space where like, what does my body need? How does she feel? And that can help with your stress levels. So when you do it, you're not just caring for you, right? You're caring for your loved one. You're modeling self-regulation. You're teaching safety in your body through your presence for your kiddos to mirror that and match that, right? So there is something called polyvagal theory. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but it's basically, we've probably all heard of the survival instinct of fight, flight, or freeze, right? Where your nervous system is kind of in that space of survival where you're going to fight somebody, you're going to run, or you're going to play dead, right? Those are just basic like survival instincts we have as a human being. But then there's also something else that we like to call the rest and digest, okay? And so that is the ventral vagal. So that is where we are calm, our nervous system is not in overactive survival mode. And this is a space where like our systems are working the way they're supposed to, because like when we're in fight or flight or survival mode, like systems like digestion kind of slow down. But when we're soft, when we're at ease, those things kick back up. Okay, so we don't want to be in fight or flight all the time. We want to be in rest and digest. Okay, so you can access this ventral vagal state of calm and connection to co-regulate with the ones that you take care of. Okay, so things like those breath exercises, right? That brings your nervous system back to a state of calm. Sometimes if you're really anxious, you can run your hands under some cold water, right? To kind of shock your system into that space. And one that I really like is sour candy. So if you are in a very stressful situation, of course, if you're hyperventilating, don't put anything in your mouth. But if you're kind of stressed out and you put like sour candy in your mouth, what that does is it activates the saliva production in your mouth, and it triggers your nervous system to say, hey, you're not in danger because you're eating. And animals out in the wild, they don't eat when they're running for their lives, right? They eat when they're calm and safe. And so it's just those little tricks that you can do. So I highly encourage you guys to look up polyvagal theory and learn some of those tricks, because it can really make or break or shift your day if you're having a really stressful day. Next, we want to prevent burnout, right? So studies show that caregiver well-being directly impacts the outcome for your neurodivergent child, okay? I'm not saying don't ever get stressed, you're going to ruin your kids. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you do not take breaks for yourself, you risk burnout, and burnout will always negatively impact the people you're caring for, not just you, okay? So self-attunement practices like mindfulness, okay, that inner awareness, body scans, right? Where am I holding stress? Where am I holding tension? Okay. These all increase emotional resilience. Okay. So some final reflections for you all today. Know that what you're doing right now, every day, all day, it's not a small thing, right? It's a huge thing. You're not just managing schedules or behaviors. You're interrupting silence. You're softening old beliefs. You're widening the path for who comes next, right? How is my parenting style going to impact the way that my children show up in the world in their adult lives? And how's that going to impact the people that they are engaging with, right? So every time you offer understanding instead of shame to them or you, presence instead of punishment, figuring out what's going on before you automatically discipline, curiosity instead of control, what's going on here? How can I help? You're rewriting that story that the family tells itself, okay? And it's not easy, but it is very sacred. And so I want you to remember this today. You're not alone. You're not behind. You're not broken. You are a guide, and you are allowed to need care too, okay? So we're not aiming for perfect families. We're just aiming for maybe more aware, compassionate, and resilient families. So that system, when we all shift to cope, we use healthy mechanisms to do that, right? So nobody's getting neglected, nobody's getting ignored, no one's having to shrink themselves into the shadows to keep the peace, right? We acknowledge that that's what's happening, and then we give that support to that one who's doing those things, okay? So let's see here. Generational change happens not through perfection, but through pattern recognition and an intentional response, okay? A truth supported by evidence, narrative therapy, right? System theories, trauma-informed practice, all those things we talked about. It's about acknowledging the reality of the roles in your home, find out the best way to cope, and teach the people in your space how to cope so that balance can be found without people falling to the wayside, right? So this presentation was really just about hopefully inspiring you to pay more attention, be more aware to not only your responses to the neurodivergent child, but also the other people in the family system. How are they responding, right? I have one kiddo, and she would probably be the invisible child, right? She does not like to make waves. She does not like to be the problem. And so she stays very, very quiet a lot of the times. And so, me as a parent, recognizing that, acknowledging that, I will seek her out, right? What's going on? How do you feel? How can I make you feel special, right? Um, because she's, 13. She's not gonna do anything, right? I have to be the parent in that space and go out there and see how can I meet her needs as well, right? So it's really just being aware can really change how you respond and how you adapt in the family system. So that's my info today for you. I will stop my recording so we can have a little chit chat. Oop, maybe. There we go.